Hello, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So good afternoon to everybody in Asia, East Asia and Australia, and also good morning in France, Professor Martin, Macedon, and Professor early morning in France and in Europe, and good evening to Seattle, Oregon, and Hawaii. I think this is it is 1:30 p.m. in JST. So all right, and it is our great honor to have another keynote speech from Professor David Bradley of LaTrobe University in Melbourne, Australia. I think I have met Professor Bradley for the first time in Kyoto, where the International Conference on Indigenous Languages was held in 2000. And Professor Bradley gave us impressive lecture on indigenous languages in mainland Southeast Asia. After that, I have participated in the Sino-Tibetan conference, which Professor Bradley organized at LaTrobe University in 2003, which definitely made me a tremendous impact. As everybody knows, Professor Bradley is an acclaimed linguist of Tibeto-Burman languages and has published many impressive papers and books, which all of you have read, I think. Professor Bradley covers all areas of Tibeto-Burman linguistics, but he especially wrote papers on Ngui Burmese languages, Lahu, Akha, and Lisu. I think several years ago, Professor Bradley published a dictionary of Southern Lisu, which presents enormous information together with Fraser orthography. Professor Bradley has been a president of Comité International Permanent des Linguistes, which I joined in 2018 in Cape Town of South Africa. Today, so we will have Professor Bradley's keynote speech on Lisu Deictics, which I am sure will inspire all the participants here. Now, I would like you to welcome Professor Bradley with your full applause. So thank you very much for Professor Bradley. And so if you are ready, please share the screen with us and start your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to join you all, and I'd like to thank Professor Hayashi and all his colleagues for their organization of this conference. It's wonderful to see you all. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, maybe next year. I'll be talking today about Lisu, and I'll be dividing this talk about Lisu Deictics into 5 parts. The first part is a brief background. The second part talks about the deictic systems of a number of related languages, showing the patterns that these languages use for their deictic systems. The third part talks about the deictics of Lisu itself. The fourth part looks at the syntax of deictics, where they fit in the noun phrase, and how the noun phrase is formed. And then the last part will look at some statistics on the way that the deictics are actually used in natural texts and other kinds of texts. So Lisu is a Tibeto-Burman language, as you all know. It's in the Burmic subgroup, and within Burmic, it's E branch or Ngui or Loloish, and within Ngui it is central. The closest languages are Lamo and Lipo. It's also close to several other languages spoken in north-central Yunnan, such as Talu and Kwanse and so forth. Within the same subgroup of Ngui, we also have Lalo, Lulo, Micha, Sani, and so forth, and also Lahu and Jino a little bit further away. Lisu has over 1 million speakers, 5 varieties, mostly in China, but 3 also spoken in other surrounding countries. For some reason, my screen is not moving. I think it may be because I'm also co-host, so I have to admit people into the, okay. So of the 5 varieties of Lisu, the most distinct is Eastern Lisu, spoken in Sichuan and in parts of north central Yunnan. Then there is Weishi Lisu, spoken in Weishi County and surrounding areas. Then 3 western varieties spoken along the Salween or Nujiang River, which runs from here through Nujiang, through Dehong, across Myanmar, forms the border between Myanmar and Thailand for a while, and then flows into the Bay of Bengal. So within Lisu, the eastern Lisu are here. You can see my cursor, I presume. The Weishi Lisu are here. The northern Lisu are here, extending, as I said, into Burma and also into India, one village. The central Lisu are here in Baoshan and Dehong prefectures in Yunnan, and also nearby in the Kachin state and northern Shan state of Burma. And southern Lisu are here in Mogo and southern Shan state and Thailand. I'll be talking about some other languages, so while I have the map up, I'll show you where they are. Lipo, the language most closely related to Lisu, is spoken here. The Jinsha or Upper Yangtze River runs through here and then along and joins and becomes the border between Sichuan and Yunnan about there. The Lipo are south of that river and the Lisu are all north of that river. Then the other languages I'll be mentioning briefly when I get to my talk about what are the Deictics include Katso, which is spoken here, south of Kunming, Sani, which is spoken southeast of Kunming, Hani, which is spoken here, Akha, which is spoken here, Lahu, which is spoken here, and Burmese, which I'm sorry, I'm going to call Burmese and not Myanmar, which is spoken here. Just briefly to talk about writing systems, there are 4 major writing systems for Lisu. One is really for Lipo, but it was originally called Eastern Lisu by mistake and is still used for Lipo, but this is a completely different language. The main one that I'll be referring to in this talk is the alphabetic script devised by Christian missionaries led by James Fraser. I think you may need to close your view of speakers to see all of the right side of the slides. This was devised in 1914, finalized in 1917, and has been used by Christians ever since. A syllabic script was developed by a Lisu traditional religious leader, Ngwa Zebo, who is known in Chinese as Huang Renpo. And a pinyin script was developed for Lisu in the 1950s and has been used in China, although its use has more or less been stopped. My screen is freezing every time. So for some reason, my screen is not, let's try this way, no? Oh my. If that means that I'm going to have to stop sharing my screen every time I want to change to a new slide, that's going to be a problem.
Give me a call.
Hi. So, Professor Bradley, so could you press the button of the, how do you say, so, yeah, next one, I think. Could you share the screen? Yeah, and actually, so, press the button on the left hand side corner, yeah. And then, yeah, This is the next one. Press this one, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. I'm afraid so. Your voice is not able to be heard. Okay, so yeah, so it's. Could you say a word? 聞こえます？聞こえない。音が入ってない。こっちの方がいってる。あはは。で、ご本人の方が音が入ってない。I think how to say this, microphone of your computer has something wrong. Could you share the screen with us again? And I think it is possible to press the button left-hand side corner to move to the next slide. Yes. Yes, that's right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now I'm cutting out.
Now we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So there are the Lipo is not intelligible, but the other four varieties in the West are fairly easily intelligible. Eastern Lisu, as spoken in Sichuan, is not. So I'll talk now briefly about the Diactic systems of a number of closely related languages to show that Lisu has all of the types of opposition in Diactics that any of them have. In particular, if we look at languages which have systems that are similar to the systems of majority languages, that is, they have only a proximal and a distal, this and that. Languages like Katso, Lipo, Eastern Lisu and Sichuan, and Sani, I showed you those on the map a minute ago, have only a two-way system for their diactics. Then there are languages that have three-way diactic systems in which there's a proximal, a medial, and a distal. In this case, the medial is typically not medium distance, but closer to the addressee. So we have basically proximal by me, medial by you, and distal not by me or by you. So Haniaka and Lahushi are examples of this. And then we have height-based systems like we have in Lahunat, which is a nearby distal, this, a faraway distal on the same level, that on the same level, a faraway on a higher level, a faraway on a lower level, and in the case of Lahunat, also a very far form. Then also we have systems that have anaphoric diactics, that is, that they refer to something which has been preceding in the context. So if we look first at Katso as an example, this is data from Chris Donley. So this language has been in close contact with Chinese for over 700 years and has a system that has converged, therefore, with Chinese. It has forms, however, which look quite a bit like Lisu. So you have a proximal te and a distal a, and notice that they both have the same tone. And as in many of the other Ngui languages, most of the deictics all have the same tone. So there's a kind of paradigmatic collapse of some of the oppositions of tone and rhyme in the deictics. Another thing that we see about the deictics of Katso, which is also true of Lisu, is that deictics have to have something after them. So for example, the most frequent thing that you get after a deictic in Lisu is the nominalizer ma, and also in Katso, it's cognate ma. The next most common thing that you get after a deictic is the locative postposition qua, then the manner postposition le, and then the direction postposition po. Well, as we can see, the Katso forms are not the same, but the main categories are similar. Interestingly, though, Katso does not have deictics which are used as conjoined with NPs, but they are separate locative forms. They have a locative form O and a locative form O, which express medium and greater distance. So these show an interesting example which we'll see also in Lisu, where the tone changes, reflecting an expressive difference between something that's a little bit closer with a lower tone and something that's a little bit further with a higher tone. We also see how closely and deeply affected Katso has been by Chinese, by the fact that it has this Chinese li as its locative suffix on these locative forms. Looking at Haniyaka, as I say, a proximal medial distal system, these languages separated about 500 years ago. We know that from genealogies and traditional history. And as you can see, the deictic forms are cognate, but have diverged somewhat in their surface forms. So in Hani, all three have high tone. In Aka, only two have high tone. Only two have mid-tone, and one has high tone. So three-way system. Then you have, as I say, the Lahu-Shi system, which is underlying a proximal medial distal system. It has this chi, it has that by you, yi or e, and it has a distal u or o. Okay, and that's the basic system. Now, if we go to Lahu-Na, which is, of course, the variety described by Matasov, you have the proximal chi, the distal o, the distal higher no, and distal lower mo, and distal very far cho. Okay, so again, we see the same tone on all the distals, the same rhyme on all the distals, and cognate forms across the two related varieties, but Lahu-Na does not have a medial, and Lahu-Shi does not have deictic forms that are the counterparts of no, mo, and cho. What it does have, though, as we saw in Katso, is it has locative forms nalo and malo up there and down there. And also it has expressive forms like what we saw in Katso, where something that's further away than u is u, and something that's even further away than that is u. Okay, so it's not always high, it's just a different tone that makes the expressive form. Then Burmese, if we look at the Burmese forms in literary Burmese, e and to, this is Burmese as first written 900 years ago and stabilized 800 years ago, but still, of course, used as a literary diglossic high, but now pronounced with modern pronunciation, and spoken Burmese D and Ho. Well, this also shows how unstable these things are, that you can completely change your deictic forms in just 800 years, no problem. Just as we saw, for that matter, in Haniyaka, that you can change the phonetic forms somewhat. This shows that you can really change the consonants as well. Another interesting thing that spoken Burmese has, that written Burmese has kind of acquired from spoken Burmese, is that you have an anaphoric form with a prefix e. So edi, this one which we have just mentioned, the one that's present in the preceding context. And you also have a form eho, that one which we have just mentioned. And as I say, smuggled back into literary forms, edi, and I think smuggled back into literary from D, the more recent and less formal literary form. I think I see what's happening. Every time I have to admit someone to the meeting, then also it freezes my screen. So the deictics in each of these languages work slightly differently syntactically. In Burmese, the deictic precedes the head noun. In all of the Ngui languages, it immediately follows the head noun, but then what comes after that differs quite radically between languages. So for example, in Katso, you normally have, it seems, a deictic which is immediately followed by either a classifier or some other nominal postposition, which we saw like ma or whatever. And in between that, if you have a numeral other than nothing, you can have any numeral whatsoever in here between the deictic and the classifier. Similarly, in Haniyaka, you have the deictic immediately after the head. What's different about Haniyaka is that you have to have a classifier. We saw this in Bai yesterday, that very often languages which have this kind of we-type deictic structure have head noun, deictic, and then classifier. And that's their normal phrase of a noun with a deictic. In Lahu, unlike those previous languages, the normal way that you have a deictic is you have a deictic immediately after the head, followed by ve, which is the Lahu nominalizer. And then the numeral and classifier comes after that. Of course, as in most cases in these languages, when you go more deeply, you find that each language has its own peculiarities. So the proximal deictic Lahu chi can actually occur before the head noun. So you can have chi ve plus head noun, or the proximal deictic chi can occur without the ve. So head noun plus chi. That I think has a slightly abrupt or rude implication, this unpleasant noun. So in addition to that, within Lahu Shi and Lahu Na, there are differences because the proximal deictic only comes before the head in black in Lahu Na, always comes after the head in Lahu Shi. So the deictic has to have something after it. In Lisu, as we saw in those examples in the same slide as the Katsuo data, the most frequent form that occurs after a deictic is the nominalizer ma, or it can be followed by some other postposition. So for example, if we have a head noun before it, this comes from a Lisu text that I'll be talking about later, ido to ma, use this nominalizer. If the NP is not well formed without the nominalizer, you have to have something. If not the nominalizer, something else, some other nominal postposition in that slot. Now, if we look at Eastern Lisu, what we find is that Eastern Lisu is like Lipo, Sani, and Katsuo, in that it has converged to the two-way proximal distal system. This, like Lipo, Sani, and Katsuo, Eastern Lisu in Sichuan, has been in very close contact with Chinese for many centuries. So in the same way as in Katsuo, also in Eastern Lisu, Lipo, and Sani, you have to have something after the deictic to make it a well-formed deictic phrase. So you have the head noun, the deictic, and then, for example, in Eastern Lisu, ma, which is their counterpart of Western Lisu, ma. What we see, interestingly, is that the Eastern Lisu proximal form he is cognate with the Lipo proximal form and the Sani proximal form, but as we'll see in a moment, the Katsuo proximal form is cognate with the Western Lisu proximal form. Then we look at distals go. Well, this is different from all of the other languages that are a little bit to its south and east, but it turns out to be exactly the same as the distal that we have in the other four main varieties of Lisu. The proximal in central Lisu along the Shaolin and Baoshan and Dehong is te, and in the other varieties it's te, but variably also pronounced te in song language and archaic contexts and in formal literary contexts. Then there's the distal same level deictic go, which has a dialect form ge in northern Lisu and northern Nujiang, but otherwise it's just go, as we saw for that matter in Eastern Lisu. So that form there, Eastern Lisu distal go, has the same meaning as all of these three different distal deictics in the other varieties. So they have a distal same level, distal higher level, distal lower level contrast. Go, nu, or ju. The differences in consonants relate to dialect differences in the way that vowels are realized after different consonants, and consonants are realized before certain vowels. And again, we see dialect forms in Northern Lisu, which are somewhat different from the other three. In addition to the four-way contrast of those deictics, most varieties of Lisu also have a medial deictic, that one which is by you. And this has several different forms. In Northern and Weishi Lisu, it's either O or Ro. In Fugung and Gongshan, it's Ro. But in Putao and in India, it's O. And in Weishi, further east, it's also O. Interestingly, though, in Central Lisu, in Baoshan Dehong, this is Atu. So it has an A prefix, plus the proximal deictic. So this is the form that you use to refer to something that's next to the addressee. Central Lisu has this Atu form. Southern Lisu also has a form Ate, which is the exact counterpart phonologically of Atu, but it has a different meaning. It means something which is present in the immediately preceding context. So we have, for example, anaphoric deictics of all four degrees of distance. Ate, that one, this one here, which I just talked about. Ago, that one there on the same level. Anu and Aju, that one on different levels, which we just talked about. In Southern Lisu, in Northern Lisu, we also have Ate and Ago, meaning this by me, which I just talked about, and that not by me, which I just talked about. And in Weishi, we have an interesting form, which is a compound of the medial form O plus the proximal form T. So that one, which is both by you and by me, the one which we just talked about. So those are the five main deictic forms that occur in most varieties of Lisu. In addition, there are also, as we saw in Katso and Lahushi, expressive forms that have, in this case, high tone and, where possible, a voiceless initial. So you have a voiceless initial go or gu in Northern Lisu, meaning that one which is on the same level and further away than go. And these are like all the other deictics, they occur in combination with following elements such as the nominalizer ma. And then similarly, a distal, far away, and higher deictic, nu. Now there's no voiceless nasals in this language, so you can't have nu, but you do have the high tone. And then again, some dialect differences in the vowels and the initials in some of the other varieties. And then distal, far away, ju, high tone, voiceless, because it was, as you recall, voiced in the normal distal form. So for further away, it gets voiceless, and again, some dialect differences in vowels. So all these deictics can also occur, as we saw in the case of the Katso form, followed by the locative postposition qua, which can be contracted onto the end of the deictic in a way that produces a whole series of additional one-syllable deictic forms, which are locative, and they typically are the entire NP. That is, these examples are all likely to be the whole NP. So that unlike most of the deictics, you don't have an NP preceding them, you don't have any necessity of a postposition following them, because the postposition qua has been incorporated into the deictic te. So te plus qua contracts to ta, and atu plus qua contracts to ata, and so forth. Gua, that's go plus gua, and noir, that's nu plus wa. Notice that the vowel changes a little bit across dialects. And then finally, the distal lowered, joie. Okay, again, the initials change because the following vowel has an effect on the allophonic realization of the initials here. But in principle, these are all very frequent forms, and we'll see that in text they correspond to, in some cases, up to about a quarter of the deictics that are found in normal spoken narrative. Like the non-locative forms, these contracted locative forms also have the high form possibility, so that you can say qua, that means that thing which is on the same level and far away. And that's a full NP. You don't need a noun before it. You don't need a postposition after it, because the postposition has been contracted onto the initial of the locative, and so forth. All the other forms also occur. So we've got 4 basic deictics. We've got a medial deictic. We've got expressive high tone deictics, 3 of them for all the distals. We've got medials. We've got contracted locatives with mid-tone, and then, as you would expect, contracted locatives with high tone, far away on the same level, far away higher up, far away lower down. Just to make it more interesting, and if you really want to see how linguistically sophisticated a Lisu person is, try and talk to them about this. You can also reduplicate these. You can reduplicate any deictic whatsoever at all, and you can reduplicate them to express an approximate location with the 3/3 tone, which is found on all of the deictics, other than the one medial deictic in some dialects. You can reduplicate them with a high tone on the first syllable and a low tone on the second syllable, typically with a voiceless consonant on the first and the voice consonant on the second. And you can reduplicate them with a high tone on both syllables and typically a voiceless consonant on both syllables. So you reduplicate it once, it means around there. You reduplicate it with high tone first and then mid-tone, it means they're very far away, even further away than just with a high tone. And with high tone on 2 syllables, even further than that. Okay, so the forms that occur all frequently are the contracted locative deictics, which, as I said, are about a quarter of the deictic forms in general, and they're not very frequent. I'll show you some examples from texts in a while. The less frequent forms are the forms that are just the normal deictics, like go-go, around there on the same level. So this is some of the forms that you get for the reduplicated locatives. The most normal form for the approximate is gua-gua, or you can get instead the normal deictic instead of the contracted locative in the first syllable. So that's not really reduplicated. So it's like go, go, gua, go, 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 gua, and then the gua contracts onto the go, and you get go, gua. But to make it interesting, when you get to the high plus mid-tone pattern, gua-gua or ko-gua, you can always instead also change the voicing of both syllables. You can say kwa-kwa, or you can say gua-gua, or you can say gua-gua, or you can say ko-gua, ko-kwa, or go-kwa, or go-gua. It doesn't matter what the voicing of the syllable initials is, as long as you have the 5-5-3-3 tone, it still means very far. And this is where you can really sort the good consultants from the ones who are more easily confused. In the same way, the very distant one with both tones high is normally both voiceless, but can also have either or both of the other of the initials voiced. So lots and lots of reduplicated forms. These are the higher ones. Because there's no voiceless possibility here, you only have 2 forms, one which is really reduplicated and one which is deictic plus contracted locative, noa-noa or nunwa, and so forth. And then the lower ones, the same story. As long as it's 3-3-3-3, it's all voiced. If it's 5533, then it's going to be either voiceless voiced, or it can be any voicing whatsoever in either of those two positions. And when it's 5-5, ditto. It normally would be tra-tra, but it could be tra-dra, dra-tra, and so forth. 6 possibilities. So lots of different possibilities. And very few of these actually occur in texts. You can elicit them, and once you have elicited them with someone, then he will often, having been primed, start to be using them occasionally in his conversations with you. Just to make it even more interesting, you can say it 3 times. Gua, 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 more or less there. Noa, 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 very, very far above. And tra, 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 very, very far down. Okay, so lots of different ways of manipulating the tones and the initials to express greater or lesser degrees of distance. Now, I'm on to the bit where I'm talking about the syntax of these forms. As I said, deictics almost always have something after them. They are not a well-formed grammatical NP without something after them, with very rare exceptions, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. The most frequently encountered thing that comes on the end of a deictic phrase is this nominalizer ma, which we also saw in Katso. We also saw, for that matter, the nominalizer ve on the deictic phrase in lahu, which immediately follows the deictic. You can also have other postpositions like the locative qua, or as we saw, the locative qua can contract onto the deictic to give you a single syllable locative NP, here, there, whatever. Another frequent nominal postposition is le, another is po, sorry, po. I'm speaking lahu for a minute there. It's not lahu, it's lisu po, and a few others, which we'll see in the next transparency. Another thing that can come after a deictic is a numeral plus a classifier. Now that's something that we saw occurring in this post-deictic slot when you had, for example, a deictic in Aka, a deictic in some other languages, that you can have a numeral plus a classifier immediately after a deictic, and that's a well-formed NP. In most cases, in Lisu, when you have a numeral plus a classifier, it normally has something else after it, most commonly the nominalizer ma. Then there are other things that can be in various slots. So you have, instead of a numeral, in a numeral plus a classifier, you can have a dimensional extent noun. So mya, quantity, related to the verb mya, to be many. Vu, size, related to the verb vu, to be big. He, width, related to the verb he, to be wide. And there are 6 or so more of these, what Matisoff calls extentives, the verbs of dimensional extent, which have nominal forms with a different tone, and in some cases with a different initial. These things occur in the numeral slot after a deictic. Sometimes, very rarely, the deictic alone can be a full NP. Now this happens in natural speech. Then when you are transcribing that natural speech with a speaker of Lisu, they will almost always want to put one of these other things in because, oh, the person made a mistake. They should have said ma, they should have said le, they should have said something instead of just having the deictic alone. But they do occur. People sometimes regard these as non-standard, but they do occur. So here's a template that shows you what happens in a noun phrase. There's other stuff that comes before the noun in the noun phrase that you'll read about in our forthcoming Lisu grammar. But you can have a noun, or you can have a demonstrative, a deictic by itself, without a noun. You don't need a noun, so that's optional. If the deictic is present, then you have to have something in from one of these boxes here. You have to have, most frequently, a nominalizer. Or you can have a manner postposition like le, a side postposition like po, a time postposition like da, an imperative like glottal stop. So you can put a glottal stop on the end of a demonstrative, and I'll talk about what those are in a few minutes. But much more frequently than having those things, you usually have ma. And then at the end of any NP whatsoever in Lisu, including all the ones that have deictics, you can have a topic on the end, either a primary topic, the main topic, the topic of the main clause, or a secondary topic, or a topic from an embedded clause, which are nya and na. And these have cognates in a number of related languages like Lahu and Nisu and so forth. And I suspect you would find cognates for them in your other languages as well. Okay, so we've got minimally then demonstrative plus ma, and then maybe a topic, or demonstrative plus some other nominal postposition, and then maybe a topic. But you can also put lots of other stuff in. You can put in the one of the suffixes like sh or ji, which refer to abstract nominals, a thing which is. You can put in one of these extensive nouns, the nouns of dimensional extent, such as I said, mya or vu or whatever. You can have a numeral and a classifier. If you have those things, if you have an extensive nominal, you normally have a classifier, but you don't have to. If you have a numeral and a classifier, you normally have a nominalizer, but you don't have to. Some speakers, again, as they will reject NPs that consist only of a demonstrative and put in some other marker, so also some speakers, when they're transcribing a text that has demonstrative numeral classifier, will insist on putting a ma after the classifier. And then after the nominalizer, you can get a number of other things. You can either get a quantifier, such as every aju. You can get a location marker, such as one of the dozen or so location nominals like terse, gane, and so forth, that show the location of the NP relative to some other NPs. After a location nominal, not surprisingly, you can get a locative, or you can get a locative without a location nominalizer, or you can get a locative without a nominalizer, and in which case it's very commonly, as we saw, contracted onto the end of the demonstrative. So most of this stuff is not obligatory, but it can occur in sequences. After any of these various things, instead of a locative, you can get an object marker. After the locative, you can get an ablative or an allative marker. And after anything except an imperative, as I say, you can get the topic marker. It's one or the other of them. So just to give you an example of a fairly long NP, Ana goku mama tenya, that dog, that 9, classifier for animals, nominalizer, te, the object marker, and nya. Notice the interesting fact that the go ma, the deictic phrase, is surrounding the numeral classifier phrase in this language, goku mama. And this is actually something that I haven't seen in many other languages of the Nui branch. I'd be interested to know if any of your languages have this. In addition to the uses as deictics, some of these forms are also used as discourse markers. So you can make a discourse marker meaning hey by putting an imperative marker on the end of the proximal deictic te. So you just say te, look at this. Or you can make the anaphoric deictic ati into a deictic that means something like and then, or so, the modern version of English so, which has more or less lost its original sequential meaning and has now just acquired in discourse initial function. Or you can get the same imperative suffix stuck onto the distal deictic, go, look at that. You can use the distal higher deictic in a nominal temporal anu, which means in ancient times, long ago. So this is an interesting metaphor that time is, in this sense, vertical, because long ago is above. It's also spatial in the sense of time is in front of you in the past and behind you in the future. Then, as usual in these languages, you also have forms with reduplication or elaboration. So you can say anunu, meaning very long ago, or you can say anumunu, which means long ago, and mu is country or land. Nu, long ago in a land high up there. So that's kind of a frozen elaborate in which this distal higher form occurs twice. Okay, now I had a bit of a time loss at the beginning, so perhaps I'll go a little bit into the question time and talk about the use of these deictics in genres. Now, one interesting thing about Lisu is that in different genres, there's quite a different pattern of deictic use. So in traditional songs which have 7 syllables, you don't have long NPs. Most lines have 4 syllables of NP and 3 syllables of verb. Just to give you an example, Asher Töle sit jango, Amya Töle nichuango. Töle, this way, is preceded by, in this case, a question, Asher, or Amya, how many, how much, and then followed by the verb. So we can see that the forms in dramatic long versions like this can't possibly occur in a traditional song because they only have 4 syllables for nouns. If we look at the usage of deictics in Lisu songs as sung in Thailand, we find that the proximal and distal deictics are almost the only ones used. In fact, they're the only ones used in these 3 long songs. And the deictic, which is contracted locative here, is fairly infrequent. If we look at songs from Weishi, which is a more traditional and a well-established Lisu area, we have more of the other deictics used in songs as well, even though they're only 7 syllables long. We have the proximal, the distal, distal higher, distal lower, and then the expressive distal, same level, and expressive distal, higher level. And then in, someone needs to know. Then we have ritual songs by this person who devised an orthography, Wazebo, in which he uses actually quite a lot of contracted locatives. So some genres use none in New Year songs in Weishi, and other genres, ritual songs, use a lot. If we look then at the literate Lisu, who use the Christian orthography to write Lisu, their language is simplified, probably because the differences in Lisu would lead to communication difficulties, and we can't have the Bible being difficult to understand. The Lisu book language was simplified and uses only the proximal and distal forms. It doesn't use the distal higher, distal lower, and all those expressive forms at all. And it also is simplified in various other ways. The evidential system is simplified, the epistemic system is simplified, the discourse markers are simplified, everything is simplified. It also has a mixture of lexicon from Central and Northern Lisu. So when writing and when speaking in Christian and other formal contexts, literate people often use the literary forms, which for the deictics are the forms of Central Lisu. So if we look at some texts, the Bible, I've only looked at the book of Matthew, has only proximal and distals and very few of the contracted locatives. So that reflects the fact that these forms, these other distal higher, distal lower forms, have been rejected by the people that were forming this literary standard. If we look at a translation by a Central Lisu speaker of a Lisu Christian book originally written in English, he uses a little bit of his own dialect form of the higher and lower distal. in a sermon given by a Northern Lisu pastor to a Northern Lisu congregation, he uses a very few of his own dialect, distal higher form, but on the whole, they use primarily the proximal and distal deictic and contracted locative form. In translations from Chinese, same story, only proximal and distal. I won't spend much time on this, but the second one was written by a Lisu person. I'm not sure whether he wrote it in Lisu first or in Chinese first, but no other things. Now, if we look at other texts, I'll skip a little bit here. Each variety uses its own system. Rarely the deictics are used alone. In Southern Lisu narrative, we have the following pattern. Just to make it interesting, the phone is ringing here. And as you can see, the medial deictic, ate, which is not found in Central Lisu, and which has in Central Lisu a different meaning medial rather than anaphoric, is fairly frequent. The distal higher, distal lower forms are also moderately frequent. If we look at Northern Lisu, we find the same story. That is that the majority of the forms are the proximal and distal. There are some of the anaphoric proximal, and then the distal higher and lower forms are fairly infrequent. And the contracted forms, as we saw, I didn't actually say that, but as we saw in Southern Lisu, where the contracted locatives are a high proportion of the deictics overall, also in Northern Lisu narrative. If we look at Central Lisu narrative, again, the proximals and distals are the most frequent, but you also get the expressive high tone ones, qua, chua, and the other contracted locatives, and so on. And this from one speaker. This one speaker used tokens of the reduplicated forms and one form that was triplicated. So they do use these forms. I'll skip this one. This is a narrative from Yongsheng, transcribed by a Lisu speaker from Nuzhang, Muyuzhang, who was an excellent linguist, but when you transcribe a different dialect, things can go wrong. And I assure you, things did go wrong in his transcription here. Just in summary then, the complex system of Lisu is, I think, unusual in that it has a proximal in all dialects, a medial in most dialects, a distal same level, a distal higher level, and a distal lower level in all dialects except Eastern Lisu, and anaphoric proximal and distals in some varieties, expressive distals with voiceless initial and high tone for all of the three distals, and then reduplicated and triplicated distals. So if you count them up, there's a whole lot of different deictic forms. So let me conclude by saying thank you, Bomo Shamo, and showing you my references.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Bradley. So it's really interesting and has a lot of information and fruitful discussion on Lisu Deictics. So I think so, there's also questions and comments from the audience. Okay, so Chen Xiaobei, please.
You're on mute.
Your microphone might be muted. We're not able to hear you.
Mute.
小贝开麦。
右边上面 mute 应该打开 mute Still cannot hear you, sorry.
可以打字吧？
Okay, so maybe put it in the chat.
Yeah, so I think so the Chen Xiaobei is out here. So so could you say a word from audience, other participants here? Do you have any comments,
Hello.
questions?
Did you hear me now?
Okay, good. Please.
Oh, I'm so sorry. There's something wrong with my computer. And thanks a lot, Professor Bradley. And I have a question that I noticed in some Lisu dialects, Y was realized as O in reduplications, but in some other dialects, the Diactic can be O originally. So is it a synchronic phonological rule, or is it related to diachronic change? As there was also a similar sound change from Y to O in Tibetan, I guess.
I think the answer is that this is a productive process, which is found in all varieties of Lisu that I know of, except for Eastern Lisu, and that it is something which is like the phenomena that we saw also in Lahushi and Katso, that is that we have a different tone that's marking the greater distance, and also we have a voiceless initial consonant. I don't think it's a regular alternation. It's not something that is, as it were, conditioned by the presence of a prefix.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And another question, comments? There are 3 more minutes left. Okay, so Chris.
Hi, David. Always good to hear you, and very educational talk. I'm interested, since obviously we have slightly different systems and different dialects, and you mentioned that in some written forms, there's a deliberate intent to simplify the Diactic system, but I'm wondering how language endangerment is affecting this. Do we think that the dialects with fewer Diactics, they've had erosion? Or do you think this is something that's so common that people are still actively using them?
I think it depends on your point of view. I think we can reconstruct the distal higher and lower deictics for an earlier stage of we, and therefore it strikes me as more likely that the systems which have only two-way contrast, like Katso, have eroded. But I don't think that's necessarily due to endangerment. I think in many cases it's due to 700,000 or more years of close contact with Han Chinese. That is, because Han Chinese has a two-way deictic system, so also people who are in close contact with and using Han Chinese regularly may also have their system converge without necessarily the language becoming endangered. Of course, it also may be, as it's certainly true for phonology, that deictic systems, when languages become endangered, can erode. But let me just give you a completely different example from Gong in Thailand, where they have a deictic system which is, I think, rather unusual in that it has a proximal deictic, this, and then it has a distal deictic that means that which is either to the north or to the east. And they have another one which is a distal deictic, which is either to the south or to the west. So it doesn't reconstruct further back because Gong is a Burmic language, Burmish language, closely related to Burmese, which has only a two-way system. But I think even though the language is critically endangered, they still have these deictics. So I think you can keep a system when the language is endangered, provided that it's a salient component of the language. And I think deictics are a pretty salient component of a language which is spoken in the mountains. Thank you for the question. We can talk
Yeah,
about
thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bradley, and all the participants here. And I think that the time is up. So thank you very much again. So I would like you to welcome the Professor Bradley's speech with full applause. Thank you very much. And okay, so this is the end of the second keynote speech of the part day 3, and so I would like to have we'd like to have a 10 minutes break. It's in the next session, 3-3 phonetics, to be chaired by Catherine Yan, so which will be studied from 2:30 p.m. JST. So we'll be back in 10 minutes. Thank you very much.